Did you know that 76% of Americans now say it's the worst time to buy a house in recorded history? We're experiencing a housing market that's more broken than even the 2008 crisis, with homes now costing 7 times the median household income, the highest ratio since the Great Depression. Let me show you the shocking data proving why buying a house in 2024 could be the worst financial decision you could make. In the 1990s, the average house price was around $120,000, and the median household income was $61,000. Do the math. Houses cost about twice the annual income. Even with the higher mortgage rates of 7.5%, homes were still within reach for most Americans. This was the reality for decades. Your parents and grandparents could buy a house with just 2 to 3 years of income saved up. Yes, they had to pay taxes and living expenses too. But the point is that home ownership was achievable for the average American family. Fast forward to 2016 and everything changed. The median house price had skyrocketed to $300,000, a 150% increase. Meanwhile, the median household income only grew to $71,000, just a 15% increase. Suddenly, houses cost more than 4 times the annual income. But here's where it gets really interesting. People could still somehow afford these homes. Why? Because mortgage rates had dropped to historic lows of around 3.5%. The monthly payments, while high, were still manageable for many families. In 2024, we're witnessing an unprecedented crisis in the housing markets that's shattering all historical norms. The numbers tell a devastating story. The median house price has soared to $420,000, while the median household income struggles at just $80,000. The main thing that makes this situation truly catastrophic is the combination of these inflated prices, with mortgage rates hovering around 6.5%. To put this in perspective, houses now cost more than 7 times the median income, a ratio that's completely unsustainable and hasn't been seen since the Great Depression. If you're looking to purchase a $420,000 house with a conventional 20% down payment, you're looking at an upfront cost of $84,000, more than an entire year's salary for the median household. But that's just the beginning. Your monthly mortgage payment at current rates would be approximately $3,000, and when you add property taxes and insurance, you're looking at total monthly housing costs of around $3,500. For a family making $80,000 a year, that means more than half of their take-home pay would go just to keeping a roof over their head. This isn't just a minor affordability issue. It's a fundamental breakdown of the housing market. When you consider that financial experts traditionally recommend spending no more than 30% of your income on housing, today's market is asking people to stretch well beyond their means. The gap between wages and housing costs has created a scenario where the traditional path to home ownership is becoming mathematically impossible for a growing segment of the population. And unlike previous housing crises, this isn't just a temporary bubble. It's the result of deep structural changes in how our housing market functions. To understand how we ended up in this crisis, we need to look back at a pivotal moment that fundamentally changed the American housing market, the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Before 2008, Wall Street's relationship with residential real estate was largely hands-off, with its interests primarily focused on commercial properties like office buildings, shopping centers, and industrial complexes. However, when the housing market collapsed in 2008, sending home prices plummeting by 30 to 50%, Wall Street saw an opportunity that would forever alter the landscape of American home ownership. As millions of Americans faced foreclosure and were forced to sell their homes at fire sale prices, major financial institutions like Blackstone and BlackRock stepped in with unprecedented levels of cash. These firms, which had traditionally viewed single-family homes as too fragmented and management-intensive for investment, suddenly began buying properties by the thousands. They could do this because they had something the average American didn't have during the crisis: massive amounts of capital and access to incredibly cheap financing. This wasn't just opportunistic buying. It was the beginning of a systematic transformation of the housing market. The scale of this transformation becomes clear when you look at today's numbers. In many American cities, Wall Street investors now account for 25 to 40% of all single-family home purchases. These aren't properties they're buying to sell for a quick profit. They're creating vast portfolios of rental properties, effectively becoming corporate landlords to the very same people who can no longer afford to buy homes themselves. This shift represents a fundamental change in the American housing market, where the dream of home ownership is increasingly giving way to a new reality of permanent renting from corporate landlords. The cruel irony is that many of these renters are paying monthly amounts that would have qualified them for mortgages under traditional lending standards. But with Wall Street driving up purchase prices, they're locked out of the market entirely. While Wall Street's involvement in housing was already problematic, the COVID-19 pandemic created conditions that unprecedentedly accelerated this crisis. In early 2020, as the pandemic threatened economic stability, the Federal Reserve made a decisive move to drop interest rates to near zero, inadvertently setting the stage for a housing market transformation. This policy decision, combined with massive stimulus payments and a sudden shift to remote work, created a perfect storm that would send housing prices soaring to historic heights. The dynamics at play were both complex and devastating for average homebuyers. With interest rates at rock bottom, Wall Street investors found themselves sitting on mountains of nearly free money, which they promptly directed into residential real estate. Meanwhile, the widespread adoption of remote work triggered a massive reshuffling of housing preferences, with millions of Americans suddenly free to relocate away from expensive urban centers. This surge in demand coincided with severe supply chain disruptions that crippled new housing construction, creating a severe shortage of available homes. The numbers tell a true story of this transformation. Housing prices exploded from $317,000 in 2020 to $420,000 in 2024, a mind-boggling increase of $103,000 in just 4 years. To put this in perspective, this increase alone is more than many Americans earn in 2 years of full-time work. What makes this situation particularly painful is that Wall Street investors, armed with their access to cheap institutional financing and ability to make all-cash offers, could consistently outbid ordinary families trying to buy homes. Every time a potential homeowner would come to the table with a reasonable offer, these institutional buyers would simply raise the stakes, knowing they had virtually unlimited capital to deploy. The result has been a fundamental reshaping of the housing market, where the ability to purchase a home increasingly depends not on your income and creditworthiness, but on whether you can compete with billion-dollar investment firms. Many people dismiss today's housing crisis by saying, "We've seen this before, prices always go up and down." However, this fundamental misunderstanding ignores how dramatically different today's housing market is from any previous period in American history. The current crisis isn't just another cyclical downturn. It represents a structural transformation of how housing functions in our economy, creating challenges that have no historical precedent. The unparalleled level of institutional ownership in residential real estate is at the heart of this transformation. Unlike previous housing cycles where individual homeowners and small landlords dominated the market, we now have massive Wall Street firms controlling vast portfolios of single-family homes. These corporations have virtually unlimited resources and can weather any short-term market corrections. They're not just participants in the market, they're actively shaping it, using algorithms to identify undervalued properties and deploying billions in capital to acquire them before individual buyers even have a chance to make an offer. The second critical difference lies in the severe supply-demand imbalance that emerged in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. When home building collapsed during that recession, it never fully recovered. The construction industry's capacity was permanently diminished, creating a deficit of millions of housing units that grow larger every year. This isn't just about having fewer homes. It's about a fundamental restructuring of the construction industry that can't be quickly reversed. Adding to this complexity is what economists call the interest rate trap. Millions of current homeowners are locked into mortgages with historically low interest rates of around 3%, creating a powerful disincentive to sell. Why would anyone give up a 3% mortgage to buy a new home at today's 6.5% rates? This dynamic has effectively frozen the market, with fewer people willing to list their homes, further reducing supply and keeping prices artificially high. Unlike previous housing cycles where prices would naturally lead to increased supply, these structural barriers prevent the market from self-correcting, creating a new normal of persistent unaffordability. When we examine potential solutions to this housing crisis, we're faced with three theoretically possible fixes. The first and most straightforward solution would be a significant drop in house prices, ideally falling by about 50% from the current median of $420,000 to around $220,000. This would restore the historical relationship between home prices and incomes, making houses affordable to the average American family again. However, such a dramatic price decline would likely trigger a catastrophic economic crisis, potentially worse than in 2008. Millions of homeowners would find themselves underwater on their mortgages, and ironically, this scenario would probably result in even more properties being acquired by Wall Street firms. The second potential solution would be a substantial increase in median household incomes. But when we look at the historical data, this seems nearly impossible in any reasonable time frame. Consider that median household income has only grown from $61,000 to $80,000 over the past 30 years. At this rate of growth, it could take decades for incomes to reach the $140,000 level needed to make current house prices affordable under traditional lending standards. This solution also ignores the reality that wage growth tends to drive inflation, which typically leads to higher housing prices, creating a perpetual game of catch-up. The third and possibly most frequently discussed solution would be a significant reduction in interest rates by the Federal Reserve, bringing mortgage rates back down to 2 to 3% range we saw in the early 2020s. While this would make monthly payments more manageable for some buyers, it's highly unlikely to happen in the near term. With inflation concerns still looming and the national debt exceeding 120% of GDP, the Fed has limited room to maneuver on rates. Moreover, we've seen that ultra-low interest rates can actually contribute to the problem by making it easier for institutional investors to leverage their purchases, driving prices even higher. This creates a painful paradox. The very tool that might make houses more affordable for individual buyers would likely be exploited by Wall Street to make the overall affordability crisis worse. To understand what this means for the average American, let's compare two practical scenarios that illustrate the stark reality of today's housing market. Consider a typical $400,000 home purchase with a 20% down payment of $80,000. At current mortgage rates of 7%, the monthly payment would be around $3,000, and when you add maintenance and taxes, the total monthly cost rises to $3,350. Over 30 years, assuming a modest 3% annual appreciation, this house would be worth about $970,000, seemingly a decent return on investment. However, if you took that same $80,000 down payment and invested it while renting a similar home for $2,300 monthly, the math tells a dramatically different story. By investing the $1,050 monthly difference between buying and renting, along with the initial $80,000, in a basic S&P 500 index fund earning the historical average of 8%, you'd end up with approximately $2.2 million after 30 years, more than double the value of the house. This simple comparison challenges the long-held belief that buying a house is always the best path to building wealth, especially in today's distorted market where traditional rules no longer apply. Are you currently trying to buy a house, or have you given up? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.